In 2006, President Barack Obama, I don't think he was president at that time, but famously or infamously said, "We are not a Christian nation." Now, the context of that, he actually said, whatever we might have been, we are not a Christian nation. He goes on to say we are a Jewish nation and a Muslim nation. And supposedly, that the original manuscript he was working from and forgot a word in was, we are no longer a Christian nation. And yet, obviously, certain ones took the phrase that was, as it was said, and ran with it. But, interestingly enough, there is a lot of truth to the statement that he has made, that we are no longer, quote unquote, a Christian nation. That having been said, understand that every time we talk about a Christian nation, we must use it somewhat accommodatively. If we talk about a pre-Christian or post-Christian nation, again, accommodatively, because there is only one nation that is truly Christian, and that's a spiritual nation, of which we are a part, 1 Peter chapter 2. And yet, there are some nations in this world that have been built on Christian morals or Christian ideals, and commonly they are referred to as Christian nations. Well, I want to suggest that we are on our way to becoming a post-Christian America. A post-Christian America. If you look up that adjective, post-Christian, you're going to find that on the chart of how much that's been used, it's only a relatively recent word, and yet it's become more and more popular in recent years, and a way to describe this nation, a post-Christian America. I want us to think as Americans, as Christians living in this country, what does it mean when people say we are a post-Christian nation? What does it mean the future holds for us? And how should we respond to all of this as Christians? This is not a political TED Talk. What this is going to be is a look at where we are. Try to see what the trends are pointing to for our future, but then decide right now what we do as Christians. About a week ago, Stephen and I were talking over lunch, and there was a phrase that was used that I came across years ago, and it was the title for a series through the book of Romans. And the title was, "When in Rome, Be a Christian." And that's in essence what I'm going to suggest this morning, is whatever America becomes or is, we need to be Christians in this nation. So let's talk first about this word, post-Christian. I looked up a couple of different dictionaries and settled in on Merriam-Webster and Cambridge as kind of basically pulling this all together. Post-Christian means following the decline of Christianity as a major religion, or relating to a period or society in which Christianity has stopped being the main religion. Now, is that true of America? I understand that many people are concerned, many American Christians are concerned about the present state of America. Is it warranted to be concerned? Yes. But are we truly post-Christian, to use this adjective as it is being used? And I'd say the answer is actually yes and no. If we're looking at true Christianity and we're looking at where we have been, we are obviously not where we used to be. And in reality, it has always been a minority, a very small minority of true Christians residing in this nation. But as far as the ideals and how things, the morality of this nation, I'm not sure that we are quite post-Christian. And let me explain that by giving a few statistics here. If we define post-Christian as no longer the majority religion, then we are not there in America. Understand, I'm using Christianity in an accommodative sense, but we are not at a minority of so-called Christians in America. In fact, most recently, we are still above the 60% mark. Granted that 20, 30 years ago, 90% of people in this country identified as Christians, so-called, but you can see the trend has gone very quickly downward, so that at present we are somewhere around 63%. Notice on the other side of this chart, and sorry it gets cut off, it only gets cut off on the TVs, not on the screen behind me, but on the religiously unaffiliated, that has gone up at about the same level that so-called Christians have gone down in this nation. Notice, it's not necessarily that a lot of other religions or even a lot of non-religious atheistic people have grown in population, but it's just people who are unaffiliated. One of the phrases that is commonly used to describe these religiously unaffiliated people is nuns, not N-U-N-S, but N-O-N-E-S. That is, they have no religious affiliation. They are not connected to any kind of denomination. They're not connected to any specific church. Many of these would claim to be spiritual, but not religious. That being said, they are no longer claiming affiliation with any kind of form of Christianity. Now, they may adopt some of the morals of Christianity. They may appreciate some of the concepts in Christianity, but they do not call themselves Christians. And so we are moving at a downward trend away from a majority of people called Christians in this nation. Now, the reason we're still at 60-something% and not right at 50-50 is because we still have older people alive in this nation. If you look at the numbers, somewhere around 80% of older generations would claim to be Christians, while down in the 20s age group and below, we're looking at somewhere just over the 50% mark. That means within a generation, we're going to go down even further, closer to a non-majority, that is maybe 50-50, and the trend continues to go downward. Those who try to project these things, looking at just anyone who claims religious affiliation with some form of Christianity, suggest that within 20 years, we're probably going to be from 30 to 40 to 50%, somewhere below the majority, claiming to be Christians. And so, as far as America is concerned, we are on a downward slide, away from any kind of connection to Christianity. And I believe the trend will continue to show that most people are going to say they are religiously unaffiliated. That number will grow as so-called Christians go downward. That being said, we are not yet, per definition, a post-Christian nation. Now, America, though not yet fully post-Christian, is definitely on the trend toward secularism. I want to define this word secularism. According to Oxford English Dictionary, it is defined as the doctrine that morality should be based solely on regard to the well-being of humankind in the present life, to the exclusion of all considerations drawn from belief in God or in a future state. I think that is, in essence, the direction that America is going. It is going toward a religion of secularism. And I'm going to come back to this slide in just a moment, but there's a quote from David Davenport, who has some connections to restoration groups. He said, "My country, 'tis of thee, sweet secularity with a capital S, will be our new national hymn as America enters the uncharted territory of a post-Christian era." And I don't think he is entirely wrong. Because though it takes on different titles, this God of secularity, the God of the here and now, the God of what we can observe and that there is no proof of anything above or beyond this life, that is basically agnosticism, atheism, scientism, is basically this concept of secularity. That we are making that distinction between the secular and the spiritual. And we are saying the secular is our all-knowing, all-wise God. That is the trend. That is where we are going. And if that sounds familiar at all, it's because every nation has moved in some direction similar to this. Paul even talked about in 1 Timothy chapter 4, the slide of Christians away from the objective faith that has been revealed. Or look with me in 2 Timothy chapter 3. 2 Timothy chapter 3. 2 Timothy 3 and verse 1. "But realize this, that in the last days difficult times will come, for men will be lovers of self, lovers of money, boastful, arrogant, revilers, disobedient to parents, ungrateful, unholy, unloving, irreconcilable, malicious gossips, without self-control, brutal, haters of good, treacherous, reckless, conceited, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, holding a form of godliness, although they have denied its power. Avoid such men as these. Now, he wasn't predicting America, but he was predicting the general trend of what men do. As they move away from God in these last times, it is going to be toward self, toward society, and not toward spirituality. This, I believe, is the definition of secularity. And I think this is the trend. This is what's going to make us a post-Christian nation, so-called, is when we forget God and we only focus on self. How are we getting there? Well, one of the common assumptions is that whatever Europe is doing, just give it 20 or 30 years, and America will be doing the same thing. Now, I believe there is some truth to that. I believe that we do often follow in the footsteps of Europeans, and specifically, since so many countries in Europe have adopted kind of a secular mentality, I think we may be tracking along with them at some level. However, I would offer some warning before we just say, look at Europe, and that's exactly what America is going to be. And here's why. Because America was founded on something different than what many European nations, especially secular European nations, were built on. America was founded on the idea of religious freedom and diversity/integration. Now, do we always hold to those ideals? I don't believe so. But those two were supposedly the foundations of America. That has altered the way we are going to trek toward post-Christianity if we get to that point. I'm borrowing from an article by Carl Jan Christian Roth, who is from Norway, and he was comparing Norway's religions and America's religions and seeing some of the differences that were happening there. And he was saying the reason why so many European nations have gone secular is because they had state-run religions. And he said, when you see the folly of that, you're going to leave that behind much quicker than you would on religions that are based on religious freedom and diversity, as in America. Doesn't mean we're not going to get to the same place, but we may just take a different trek there. Here's why I think we are going to follow Europe at least at some level. And that is because we have adopted some of the same philosophies, and we have prided ourselves in the same prosperity as many of these secular nations that have gone before us. Philosophy such as postmodernism, that we're going to talk about in just a moment, and prosperity in America has created an increasing level of cynicism toward religious institutions. If you ask the average person on the street, they will probably say, I am spiritual, but I don't want necessarily to have anything to do with religious institutions. I don't want to have anything to do with a church. We will come back to that in just a moment. But also, there's a growing satisfaction because of our prosperity with our secular fulfillment. Have you noticed, at least as I remember, many Christians, whenever they were making their decisions for voting 20 years ago, would say, I may or may not like his economic policies, but whatever are his morals, that's what I'm going to vote for. I've seen kind of a shift to what's going to be best for the economy of the nation, regardless of what the person's morals may be. One of the reasons I think we are trending toward secularism is because we might be missing what it looks like to try to be righteous in a nation. I'm not saying that economy is not important, but that's not the focus of the Christian. The focus of the Christian is, what does God want me to do here in this nation where I am, regardless of what the leaders are doing, regardless of what the trends are, what am I focusing on? And if I start adopting some of the same philosophies, if I start adopting some of the pride and prosperity that the people around me, I should not be surprised if my Christianity looks more like post-Christianity. I need to realize that these things have always been dangers to nations. In Deuteronomy chapter 6, God even warns about these same kinds of dangers. In Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 1 through 5, or 10 through 15. Deuteronomy 6, verses 10 through 15. Then it shall come about when the Lord your God brings you into the land which he swore to your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to give you, great and splendid cities which you did not build, and houses full of good things which you did not fill, and hewn cisterns which you did not dig, vineyards and olive trees which you did not plant, and you eat and are satisfied, then watch yourself, that you do not forget the Lord who brought you from the land of Egypt out of the house of slavery. You shall fear only the Lord your God, and you shall worship him and swear by his name. You shall not follow other gods, any of the gods of the peoples who surround you, for the Lord your God in your midst is a jealous God. Otherwise, the anger of the Lord your God will be kindled against you, and he will wipe you off the face of the earth. Notice he says, if you get involved in the idolatry and you get caught up in the prosperity, you better watch out, because that is the opportunity for you to forget me. What are we doing in America? We are serving secularity with a capital S, and we are serving ourselves with the prosperity of those who have gone before us. And we think we're going to get to a different place than Israel. We need to recognize that it's not just that we are following nations that have gone before us in the past 100 or 200 years. We are following every nation that has ever turned away from God. And this is where it's going to lead. So, what should we then do with this cultural change that is around us? Well, first, I think we need to get a handle on what kind of changes are happening in America. Again, I put this in quotes, using it accommodatively. America started with so-called Christian values. But I suggest that because of the Enlightenment, you've heard that expression used from this pulpit from time to time, but because of Enlightenment thinking, even the Founding Fathers were beginning to sow the seeds of secularism in this nation. I'm going to give an example of that in just a moment. But I want to suggest that it's not that we are just trying to get back to what did the Founding Fathers think, because they had their own problems. It's what would righteousness in a nation look like? Proverbs chapter 14 and verse 34. Understand, I know we're not a theocracy. I know we're not going to have the same kind of government as a nation that Israel had. But I'm suggesting that a nation will still be rewarded by the fruit of righteousness in it. And I want to suggest that we were moving away, even from the very beginning of this nation, from the concept of understanding righteousness defined by God. In the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson, in his original draft, wrote, "We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable." Now, most of you probably know what that was changed to by Benjamin Franklin. He crossed out sacred and undeniable and put self-evident. I think that has to do with some of the thinking that was going on even at that time. I'm not setting up Thomas Jefferson as the great religious person of the nation at that time, but you know, I prefer sacred and undeniable as it relates to the truths. As soon as we take truth away from God and make it something that can be determined purely by our own reason and by the consent of the governed, that is just self-evident to everyone, and not why it is self-evident, because it is sourced in Him who is truth, then we've already taken a step away from where we need to be as an individual, as a people, as a nation. Because truth, he's talking about specific truths. But truths are always, if they are truth, going to be bound up in God Himself. We are going to learn truth from God himself. And if we start to think that we have figured out truth on our own, we have adopted a secular mindset. Because we think we figured it out, and we think it is truth that is good for the present, but we have stripped it of its divine and eternal consequence. That was already at the beginning with the Declaration of Independence. Now, we didn't have to keep trekking away from God, but is it any surprise that we have as a nation? Whenever we begin to forget who God is and what truth is. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. There's a lot of big words here that many probably aren't going to care much about. But I'm just going to say that Enlightenment thinking led to a philosophy of modernism, which basically said we can figure this all out on our own. Just break it down to its most basic components. There were a lot of good German modernists. I guess I should say Germans who were good modernists, but that doesn't necessarily make them a good person, because modernism isn't necessarily going to get you to God. It is going to say that we can figure this out on our own. In fact, some of the great modernist scholars in Europe and in America in the 18 and 1900s would say, we are actually trying to help defend God. How? By taking God out of the picture and proving it on our own. Misguided. But then, is it any wonder that people began to swing the other direction and say, no, it's not that we can absolutely authoritatively figure everything out on our own, it's that we can figure out nothing on our own. And that's postmodernism in essence. And it says that, in essence, there is no authority you should trust except the authority of self. Proverbs 3, verses 5 through 6 says the complete opposite of that. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your path straight. Whether it's postmodernism or modernism or Enlightenment, any human philosophy that says trust yourself or trust the authorities of man and does not say trust in the Lord is a misguided worldview that is going to lead you to disaster as a nation, as a person. Proverbs 3 is absolute truth. It is the way to have your path made straight. Trust in the Lord, not in your own understanding. Another set of big words, you can ignore it if you want. But in essence, where we have gotten to, and I'm borrowing a lot from denominationalist Vadi Bakum here with his book, The Ever-Loving Truth. He's actually just come out with a revised edition in 2023. He wrote it way back in 2004 for the first edition. And I think he may have added one more element to what he had in 2004. And he said, in essence, the foundations of a post-Christian nation, of post-Christianity, of post-Christian America, is relativism, self-actualization, tolerance, and pluralism. Let me bring that down to words that I use every day. Number one is that there is no absolute truth. Interestingly enough, they are very inconsistent in that. And even if they admit some absolute truth, they would say there may not be any absolute moral truth. So what is all important is that you discover your truth. What are you? What does it mean to you? What is most important to you? You find your own purpose in this life. And if everyone is finding their own purpose, then you better be tolerant of the other person, because you can't make your truth their truth, because that's their truth. And furthermore, we need to all just find a way to coexist with each of our individual truths and each of our individual purposes in life. It is taking away God as the ultimate truth. And Jesus, in very simple terms, denied relativism, self-actualization, tolerance, and pluralism when he said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Very objective, very exclusive statements that are destroying the foundations of postmodernism and of post-Christianity. I think you can already see that the way to get away from post-Christianity is to get back to simple Christianity. And we're not going to make this a Christian nation, but we can make Christians in this nation. And we can help them to understand Jesus is truth. And it doesn't matter what you think your purpose and identity is, everything stems from him. And it doesn't matter if someone thinks their truth is right when it's a lie. You rely on the truth, and you be objective, absolute, and exclusive on that. We're going to deal with approaching that a little bit more nuanced in just a moment. But in essence, we need to get back to there is divine, sacred, undeniable truth. Because as soon as we leave that foundation behind, the walls are going to crumble in this nation. It is because what is right, righteousness, exalts a nation, but sin is a reproach to any people. We're not doing anything very different from those who have gone before us. And I'm going to suggest, as we think a little bit about a post-Christian America as actually being a pre-Christian America, we are echoing history with the Romans. I was reading Tacitus a couple of days ago. I know, fun reading that everybody likes to do. But as I was reading Tacitus, it was giving the history of Claudius. And he decided that he wanted to marry his niece, Agrippina. Agrippina is actually the mother of Nero, great reputation for both of them. But Claudius decided he wanted to marry his niece, and that was considered incest. And the senators and the other officials agreed, yeah, that is incest. You can't do that. We haven't done that before. Well, Vitellius, not the Vitellius who becomes the emperor for a short time in 69 AD, but his father, Lucius Vitellius, defended the proposal. He said this: "Rather let a precedent be now set for the taking of a wife by an emperor, but it will be said, marriage with a brother's daughter is with us a novelty." That is, this is something new. This is something different. True, but it is common in other countries, and there is no law to forbid it. Marriages of cousins were long unknown, but after a time they became frequent. Here's the phrase: custom adapts itself to expediency, and this novelty will hereafter take its place among recognized usages. Again, he's using some language that we may not commonly use, but did you hear what he said? He said, we make the laws, we determine what is best, and if we set down the precedent, we get to decide. And you know what? If this was accepted, let's just take it to the next level, and now this can be accepted. And if this becomes accepted, we can take it to the next level, and this can be accepted. Does that sound familiar? That is the result of post-Christianity. Granted, this was this is during Christianity, before Christianity had a big influence in the Roman Empire. But post-Christian America looks like this. It's saying, we determine truth, and we can take this as far as will be accepted and that will be expedient for whatever we're trying to accomplish at the moment. This is complete opposite of what God expects of his people. And so with this changing culture, I want to offer some hope as we close out our study. I'm going to present hope by first saying, here's where there is no hope of changing this nation. And that is, I believe there are too many so-called Christians and even true Christians who recognize the growing problem of post-Christianity, but look for solutions in all the wrong places. They see the problem of secularity with a capital S, and what do? They secularize to appeal to those who are secular. They see the problem of putting your trust in princes, and what do? They try to politicize, and they try to change the nation by getting involved in politics that they have no business being involved in. They try to change the world by setting up, institutionalizing religion. And that's the very thing that people are leaving. We're not going to save this nation by picking the right leader, necessarily. We're not going to save this nation by becoming like the world around us. We're not going to save this nation by becoming something bigger than what God wants us to be. I think about the Pharisees and the Sadducees. They thought they could save the nation through their various ways of political maneuvering and making the right alliances and not doing some things that they ought to be doing and doing certain things that they ought not to be doing because they thought it was for the good of the nation. That kind of mentality led them to say, "Put this man to death, lest we lose our nation and our place." And that's what's going to happen to Christians if we ever start trying to find answers to a big spiritual problem outside of a spiritual solution. Righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is a reproach to any people. We as Christians will never possess cultural power or prestige. I want us to understand that. Christians will never possess cultural power or prestige. Our task is to embrace our unique, holy identity and not to seek cultural acceptance. How did Christians change the Roman Empire? It's not by becoming like the Romans. It's by becoming Christians. In 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 13 through 16, how are they going to change an unholy nation? By being holy as God is holy. How are they going to affect the government that was going to begin persecuting them very soon? Said, be a good citizen and honor Christ in your life. Says, whenever everyone is around you is sinning and they think it's a surprise, you live a completely different life. There's an article by Luke Capps in the Bulletin called Trendy Imperfectionism. The first century Christians didn't change the world by saying we are just like you. They changed the world by saying God has completely changed us. And what did that lead to for them? It led to something that looks like our post-Christian nation, or quote-unquote post-Christian nation. It led to maligning, led to mocking, led to people who are attacking them for their faith. And yet what's he say? You suffer, but you suffer well. And you live the life of a Christian. And God is going to rescue you. You may not be noble born, you may not be considered wise in this world, but you have received the revelation, the truth of God. Stand fast in that. Stand fast in the true grace of God, says Peter later on in that letter. I want to suggest, and I may have suggested this in the past, but a post-Christian America is actually a pre-Christian America. What do I mean by that? It is an opportunity for us. It is not that all is lost for Christians when people start leaving nominal Christianity in this world. It is an opportunity for us to show what true Christianity looks like. It's our opportunity to change this world, and I know it was used as kind of a pejorative in Acts chapter 17 and verse 6, but to turn the world upside down. Really, we want to turn the world right side up. And the only way it's going to do that is by getting the right foundations underneath it. What does that look like? I want to suggest two things to take home with you today. Is that as we see this nation sliding away from so-called Christianity, at least from the values of the truth, and getting involved in postmodernism, relativism, pluralism, there are two things we can do. We can change the ethics by showing the standard of ethics, and we can change people's mind about Christianity by showing the relevance of Christianity. Now, understand that's already based on the foundational point of point number 1 on this slide. It's not that we make it relevant by making it look cultural, but it's that we show people what truth looks like and why it is important to their lives. First thing I'd like to point to is an illustration I'd gather from Kyle Harper in his book on From Shame to Sin. And what he's doing as a historian in that book is basically saying, how did we go from the sexual ethics of the Roman Empire to within 3 or 4 centuries, now basically everyone at least accepts nominally Christian ethics on sexuality. They didn't pick it. They didn't try to overrun the government. What did they do? They lived it out in their lives. They lived it out in their marriages. They lived it out in their slave-master relationships. They lived it out with their neighbors. What did it look like in Rome? Sexual activity looked like in Rome? It looked like an open outlet for unrepressed lust. I'm not going to define all these terms because we have a mixed audience. You can look it up if you want. Rome was full of pederasty and homosexuality and prostitution and sexual slavery. Some of those same things still exist in our world today. But I want to suggest that they were able to change that, not through legislation, but by sound living. Because within a few centuries, now at least nominally again, it was considered a limited willful act, that is sexual activity. In essence, within a few centuries, the Romans were even saying sexual activity should be reserved for heterosexuals in marriage. Why? Because Christianity had made an effect in the world. How are we going to change the ethics of this world? We're going to show them the ideal, the standard of Christ, and help people to see why that is important. Now, I say why it's important is because 39% of unaffiliated people say the reason they don't go to church is because they do not see church as necessary. Now, for some of us who grew up and always heard, you need to go to church. Church is necessary. We need to understand we're living in a world where many people now are going to say, I just don't see why it's important. I don't see why I need to go to church. And we're not going to convince them by just saying, well, it is. That's just the way it is. You need to know that it's necessary. We need to show them, why is it necessary? Because there is a God. Jesus is God's Son. The Bible is God's Word. And He expects us to become Christians and live in community with one another in a church. We got to show the relevance of sin and the reality of hell and heaven. We need to help people realize that what they have slid away from is thinking as merely man-made traditions that are outdated and are lost to a modern culture. It says we need to show them that the truth is alive and well. We need to let the Word of God go forth from our lips and change people's lives. Now understand, this is a great opportunity because though 39% say they don't see it as necessary, they're kind of indifferent about religion. Said, why would you go to church? 32% said they would go to church to grow spiritually. Why do we often think people would want to go to church? Oh, it's this secular thing, this entertaining thing. Most people would say, the only reason I go to church is if I felt I could grow spiritually. Understand, they may be defining things completely different, but I think that's a significant percentage of people who recognize spirituality is still important, but they don't see the connection. And so when I say that a post-Christian America is going to be a pre-Christian America, it's because I believe when all the nominal Christians fall off, and when the numbers look low, and when we look like a minority, that is when we can say, this is what it looks like to be a Christian, and this is why you need to become a Christian. And there are going to be some people who want to hear that. Because there are going to be some people who are so fed up with no standard. And they're so fed up with what life has given them when they've abandoned that standard that they're going to be ready to listen to the absolute standard. A post-Christian America is actually a pre-Christian America. So we need not bewail that many people are becoming unaffiliated with Christianity. Most of them weren't Christians anyway. But what we can do is say, here are opportunities with people who are not even atheists, just unaffiliated, and don't see why this is important. And we can preach the good news of Jesus Christ to them. And when more and more Christians live in this world, it's going to shine brighter and brighter, and righteousness will exalt a nation. Let's not look for secular solutions to spiritual problems. Let's look to Jesus Christ. If you need to respond to the Lord in any way, we're about to ask a question of one another. Who will follow Jesus? Because he is the way, the truth, and life, and no one comes to the Father except through him. Doesn't matter what nation we are living in, this gospel is for all, and if you will follow Jesus, he will lead you to the Father. He will lead you to heaven itself. It's not just about the here and now. It's ultimately about the hereafter. And if you're not ready to meet your Maker, why don't you let us help you as we stand and as we sing.